My husband tucked a stranger's bracelet into the lining of my suitcase the night before our flight to Charleston, and I found it before he did. Some things in a marriage start out looking as small as a loose thread hanging off a hem, a scent that doesn't belong to you clinging to a collar, a sentence caught through a half-open door. But pull on that thread long enough, and an entire curtain of carefully arranged lies comes down at once. I found the thread on a Tuesday night in April, kneeling on our bedroom floor with a suitcase open in front of me like a mouth about to speak. My name is Olivia. I'm 34. For 6 years, I've been married to Daniel Whitfield, a man 8 years older than me who built a real estate development firm in Denver out of nothing but a business degree, a talent for charm, and an instinct for knowing exactly which room to walk into and which one to avoid. Before I married him, I worked as a graphic designer at a mid-sized agency downtown. The kind of job that paid enough to keep my own name on a lease and not enough to impress anyone at a dinner party. Daniel used to say he loved that about me, that I wasn't chasing his money. Later, I would understand that what he actually loved was that I didn't have the resources to leave. A woman married to someone like me doesn't need to sit in traffic every morning, he told me 2 months after our wedding, one hand resting on the small of my back like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't agreed to. Let me take care of things. You take care of us. I was 28 and in love, and, if I'm honest, a little relieved. I didn't understand yet that some men don't want their wives home because they want to protect them. They want them home because a woman who doesn't know the business can't ask questions about the business. A woman with no income of her own has no leverage. A woman who spends her days choosing throw pillows has very little reason to go looking through her husband's briefcase. I've always been a careful packer. It's one of the only habits from my old life I kept. Neutral clothes folded on the left, anything with color folded on the right, toiletries zipped into their own bag, chargers coiled and rubber banded, boarding passes printed even when they're already on my phone, because phones die and paper doesn't. Daniel used to tease me about it, standing in the doorway of our closet with his arms crossed, watching me lay out 3 days' worth of outfits like I was planning a military campaign. You'd think we were flying into a war zone, he'd say, checking his watch. Always his watch, as if time only existed to remind him he was busier than me. I never argued back. If you've been married long enough, you learn that not every comment from a husband deserves a response, because the moment you respond, you've handed him a debate to win. That Tuesday night, I was doing my usual pass through the suitcase, running my hand along the inside pockets to make sure nothing had shifted, when my fingers caught on something that didn't belong. A small, hard, rectangular box, wedged into the zippered compartment meant for shoes, wrapped in black felt. I sat back on my heels and stared at it for a second before I even picked it up, the way you stare at a door in your own house that you don't remember being there before. Inside the felt was a slim jewelry case, the kind with a hinge that clicks shut like a small, expensive secret. I opened it. A tennis bracelet. A delicate line of diamonds set in white gold, small enough to be tasteful, expensive enough that I knew immediately it wasn't from any store Daniel and I had ever walked into together. Underneath the velvet insert where the bracelet sat, my thumb found a seam that gave a little too easily. A false bottom. Inside it, folded flat, was a USB drive taped to a folded sheet of paper. I want to be clear about something. I did not go looking for this. I have never, in 6 years of marriage, searched Daniel's phone, followed him, or hired anyone to watch him. Because for a long time, I believed that a marriage built on suspicion wasn't a marriage worth having. I was wrong about a lot of things that year, but I wasn't wrong about that. I didn't go looking. It came looking for me, hidden in the one part of my own life I still controlled completely. I could hear Daniel down the hall on a call, his voice low the way it always got when he thought I couldn't hear him, though our house has thin walls and I've had 6 years to learn the particular register he uses when he's saying something he doesn't want repeated. "The flight's booked," he was saying. "We'll sort the rest out once we're there. She won't know. Relax. She won't know." 4 words, light as breath, and colder than anything I'd heard him say in years. She won't know. I sat on the floor with the felt box in my lap and unfolded the paper. It wasn't a note. It was a printed wire transfer confirmation dated 3 weeks earlier for an amount that made my stomach drop before my brain even finished reading the number. $41,000 moved from an account I recognized as belonging to Whitfield Development's Charleston Project Fund into an account I did not recognize at all. Below the routing information, in Daniel's small, cramped handwriting, was a single initial, V. I plugged nothing in that night. I didn't need to. I already had a name in my head, because there was only one V in Daniel's professional life who'd earned the kind of trust that let her sign for wire transfers without 3 other people in the room. Vanessa Cole, 28 years old. Daniel's executive assistant for the past 2 years. The woman who answered his phone before his own mother could get through. Who flew with us on every business trip for logistics. Who called me Olivia in a voice so sweet it curdled a little on the way to my ears. I had met her at 3 company holiday parties. She always complimented my dress and then looked at it a beat too long, the way you look at something you're measuring yourself against. I put the bracelet back exactly as I'd found it, felt around the false bottom, wire confirmation folded the same 3 times, case clicked shut, wedged back into the shoe compartment at the same angle. I have always been a careful packer. That night, for the first time, the skill served a purpose I never imagined I'd need it for. Strangely, I didn't cry. I want to tell you it was because I was strong, but that would be a kind of lie too. The truth is that certain wounds, inflicted often enough in small enough doses over a long enough time, stop making a person cry. They just make a person quiet. I sat on our bedroom floor for a long time after Daniel finished his call, listening to him move around the kitchen, humming something under his breath. A man completely at ease in a house he was about to detonate. I took a photo of the bracelet with my phone before I closed the box the last time. I don't fully know why. Some instinct in me, older than logic, wanted proof that I hadn't imagined it. I sent the photo to my best friend, Renee, with a single line. "Can you tell what this is worth?" She wrote back almost instantly. "Wait, what? Whose is this? Are you okay?" I looked at her message for a long time and didn't answer it. Some things you can't explain in a text message at 11 at night. Some things you have to sit inside of first, alone, until you know what shape they are. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, the way you do when your body has been keeping watch all night, even while your mind pretended to sleep. Daniel had already left, a note on the kitchen counter saying he needed to swing by the office before the airport. His side of the closet was missing the navy suit I liked least on him. When I leaned in to grab my coat, I caught a thread of perfume on the collar of yesterday's shirt, still hanging on the valet stand, something sharp and floral, nothing like the soft vanilla scent I've worn since college. I didn't say anything about it to the empty room. I just filed it away, the way you file away everything when you've decided, without quite admitting it to yourself yet, that you're building a case. The driver picked me up at 8. As soon as I climbed into the back seat, he mentioned, politely and without any idea of what he was handing me, that we'd be swinging by the office first to collect Ms. Cole before heading to the airport. I said that was fine. I said it in the same voice I'd used to order coffee that morning, flat and pleasant, a voice that gave nothing away because there was nothing left in me that wanted to give anything away. Vanessa was waiting outside the building when we pulled up, a small silver hardshell carry-on at her side, wearing a cream blazer that looked like it cost more than my entire outfit. She slid into the car, flashed a smile that reached exactly as far as her teeth and no further, and said, "Good morning, Olivia. I love that coat." I told her good morning back and complimented nothing of hers, because I had decided somewhere between my bedroom floor and the back seat of that car that I was done handing people compliments they hadn't earned. The whole ride to Denver International, Vanessa stayed on her phone, talking rapid fire about contract addenda, closing timelines, a meeting she needed moved to Thursday. She spoke with the clipped confidence of someone used to being obeyed, not someone used to being managed. I watched the city slide by through the window and found myself, absurdly, almost laughing. In my husband's professional life, the woman who carried herself like the person actually running things wasn't me. It had never been me. I had just never let myself see it before. At the airport, Daniel had already gone ahead through the priority lane, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing at something only he could see. I told Vanessa to go on without me, that I wanted to grab gum and a bottle of water, and she nodded without really looking at me and wheeled her silver carry-on toward the security line. I stayed back by the check-in kiosks, where the crowd was thick enough to swallow small movements whole. Announcements overhead. A stroller wheel squeaking somewhere behind me. A child crying 2 lines over. It was, I remember thinking with a strange, cold clarity, the perfect kind of noise to disappear inside of. I unzipped my suitcase at the edge of the kiosk bank, pulled out the felt box with the bracelet and the wire confirmation still tucked into its false bottom, and walked the 15 feet to where Vanessa's silver carry-on sat, momentarily unattended, propped against a pillar while she checked something on her phone a few yards away. Her bag had no lock. I unzipped the outer pocket, slid the felt box inside, zipped it shut, and was back at my own suitcase in under 30 seconds. My hands weren't shaking. I noticed that, distantly, the way you notice a detail about someone else's life. My hands weren't shaking at all. I checked my larger suitcase, walked toward the security line at an unhurried pace, and found Vanessa already through, waving at me from the other side of the scanners, telling me to hurry, we'd miss boarding. I smiled, put my jacket and phone and tote into the gray bin, and stepped through the metal detector. No alarm. Nothing at all, until Vanessa's silver carry-on rolled out of the X-ray belt and a TSA officer lifted a hand before she could grab it. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside for a moment. We're going to take a look in this bag." I watched Vanessa's face shift, a flicker of confusion sliding fast into something closer to alarm. "There's nothing in there, it's just work files," she said, already reaching, already being told to wait. Daniel, who had cleared security minutes earlier and was checking his phone by the shoe-tying benches, glanced up at the commotion, frowned, and walked over the way men like him always walk toward trouble, like it's beneath them to hurry, but they'll grace it with their presence anyway. "She's my employee," he told the officer, an easy, practiced authority in his voice. "That bag's just company documents I can vouch for." He didn't get to finish. The officer had already unzipped the outer pocket and pulled out the black felt box. I have replayed Daniel's face in that exact moment more times than I can count in the months since, and I don't think I will ever get tired of it, which probably says something about me I'm not proud of. His smile didn't fall so much as freeze mid-motion, like someone had hit pause on a video a half-second too late. His eyes went from the box to Vanessa to me, and something in his hand twitched toward his jacket pocket, an old habit, reaching for a phone or a wallet or anything that might save him, except there was nothing in that pocket that could. "Whose bag is this?" the officer asked, holding the felt box up. Vanessa shook her head fast, too fast, denying any knowledge of it in a voice that cracked in the middle of the word, "No." The officer opened the case. The bracelet caught the fluorescent light. The folded wire confirmation slid out onto the tray, and I watched, without moving a muscle in my face, as a small knot of strangers behind us in line started to lean in, someone's phone already lifting to film the scene, the way phones always do now, hunting for content out of other people's collapsing lives. Daniel looked at me. I was standing by the bins, holding the phone I'd just retrieved, wearing the most convincing expression of confusion I have ever produced in my entire life. He swallowed, and when he spoke, the words came out slower than his usual smooth cadence, like he was translating them from a language he didn't quite trust himself in. That's mine. I meant to give it to my wife." "Yours?" I said. My voice came out soft, almost gentle, and even I couldn't have told you in that moment whether it held genuine bewilderment or something much sharper underneath it. Daniel stared at me, his mouth working around a sentence that never arrived. I let the silence sit there for exactly as long as it needed to. Then I gave a small, easy laugh, the kind you'd give at a mildly embarrassing mix-up, nothing more. "Well, that's sweet. But you really didn't have to hide it in her bag, honey. You could have just given it to me." The officer, who had no interest in the private wreckage of a marriage, only in whether the bracelet and paperwork posed any actual security concern, cleared the item after a cursory look and let us all through with the particular disinterest of someone who has seen every version of this exact human disaster 100 times before. Vanessa's face had gone the color of paper. Daniel didn't speak again until we were well past the checkpoint. I felt, walking toward our gate with my rolling suitcase clattering evenly behind me, something I hadn't expected to feel at all in that moment. Not devastation, not even anger, not yet. Just a small, quiet click somewhere deep in my chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. There are fights that don't require raising your voice. Sometimes all it takes is moving one bag 6 feet to the left and letting every lie a person has built step, blinking, into the light on its own. Boarding went smoothly enough after that, in the strained, overly polite way that boarding always goes when 3 people are pretending nothing just happened in front of 40 strangers. I had a window seat. Daniel was 1 row up, on the aisle. Vanessa, through some quiet maneuvering with the flight attendant about needing to finalize logistics with her boss, ended up in the seat beside him. I didn't object. There's a particular kind of freedom in letting someone perform for you exactly as much as they want to, because the longer they perform, the more you learn about the show they think they're running. I opened a book I never read a single line of. Daniel's jaw kept working the way it does when he's holding something back, a small muscle jumping at the hinge, and his fingers tapped an uneven rhythm against the armrest for most of the taxi and takeoff. Vanessa sat rigid beside him, staring straight ahead, throwing quick, unreadable glances toward my row every few minutes before catching herself and looking away. I understood that particular fear. When you've been caught with something that shouldn't exist, the worst part isn't that strangers saw it. It's that the one person who was supposed to be oblivious is suddenly, terrifyingly, calm. Once we reached cruising altitude, Daniel unclipped his belt and made his way to my row. He asked the man beside me, with the easy, unrefusable politeness of someone used to getting what he wants, if you'd mind switching seats so he could sit with his wife. The man looked at me. I nodded. He gathered his things and moved without complaint, and Daniel folded himself into the seat, exhaling like a man about to defuse something. "Don't make this into more than it is," he said, low, once we were both settled and the seatbelt sign had dimmed. I kept my eyes on my book. "I'm not making it into anything," I said. "That bracelet was for you," he tried. "I mixed up the bags, that's all it was." I turned a page I hadn't actually read and asked very quietly, "You mixed up which bag had a $41,000 wire transfer to an account with Vanessa's initial on it?" He went still beside me in a way that told me everything his mouth wasn't willing to. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. 6 years married to Daniel Whitfield had taught me the exact temperature his silence turned when a lie stopped working. He tried anyway, voice dropping further, claiming the transfer was for a subcontractor account Vanessa managed on the Charleston project. Standard business, nothing I'd understand without a finance background I'd apparently forfeited the right to when I left my job. I found, for the first time all morning, that I actually wanted to laugh. Standard business documents hidden in a false bottom jewelry box, wrapped around a diamond bracelet, smuggled into someone else's carry-on so it wouldn't get flagged as belonging to him. I closed the book. "Daniel," I said, "you've explained a lot since the security line. The strange thing is, I haven't actually asked you a single question yet." He stared at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I could see calculation, frustration, and underneath both of those, for the very first time in 6 years, something that looked almost like fear. Finally, he said he didn't want me getting the wrong idea, that there was absolutely nothing outside of work between him and Vanessa, that he only handled her that way professionally because she was talented, and he trusted her judgment on sensitive accounts. I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said. Those 2 syllables were so light they should have meant nothing, but I felt his hand tighten on his own knee like he'd been struck. A guilty man wants you to get angry, because anger is something he knows how to manage. He can soothe it, argue it down, redirect it. Calm gives him nowhere to stand. He sat with me a few more minutes, said nothing else worth remembering, and eventually returned to his original seat. Vanessa leaned toward him to ask something. He just shook his head. I turned back to the window and watched the clouds, white and enormous and close enough to touch, and thought about how some things look soft and solid from a distance and turn out, the moment you fly straight into them, to be nothing but fog. I opened the Notes app on my phone, the same one I'd kept a version of since college, a private habit of writing down things that mattered before my own memory could soften them into something more forgivable. I titled a new note, "The Suitcase File." First line, "Bracelet and wire transfer found in false-bottomed box hidden in my luggage the night before Charleston." Second line, $41,000 moved from Charleston Project Fund to unknown account. Initial V in Daniel's handwriting. Third line, Daniel claims mix-up. My suitcase is navy with a monogram tag. Vanessa's is silver hardshell. There is no version of this where the two get confused. I stopped on the fourth line for a moment before I let myself type it. Since this morning, Daniel has explained himself 6 separate times. He has not once asked if I'm okay. Writing that sentence stung more than I expected. Not because of the money, and not, yet, because of Vanessa. It stung because I understood, sitting in seat 14A somewhere over Tennessee, that the most painful part of this marriage wasn't that my husband might be capable of betrayal. Most people are, given the right circumstances and enough time. The most painful part was that in 6 years, it had apparently never once occurred to him that I deserved to hear a true sentence from him, just for its own sake, with nothing attached to it he needed from me in return. We landed in Charleston a little after 2. Whitfield Development was hosting a 3-day investor summit at a resort just off the harbor, a sprawling white building with a wraparound porch and rocking chairs that nobody ever seemed to actually sit in. A car was waiting outside baggage claim. Vanessa took the front seat without being asked, hugging a leather folio to her chest like armor, already back on the phone rearranging someone's afternoon. Daniel and I sat in the back. He kept his exterior polished for the driver's benefit, asking twice if I was thirsty, if I needed the air conditioning adjusted, playing, I understood now with total clarity, the role of devoted husband for an audience of exactly one person who mattered to his reputation and none who mattered to his conscience. The resort was beautiful, in the aggressively photogenic way these places always are, all whitewashed wood and hanging ferns and a pool that caught the afternoon light like a held breath. As we pulled past the entrance, I remembered, unbidden, the first business trip Daniel and I had ever taken together, 4 months into dating, when he'd carried my bag up 3 flights of stairs at a bed and breakfast in Vail because the elevator was broken, laughing the whole way, telling me he'd do it again 100 times if it meant 1 more hour with me. I wondered, watching the palm fronds slide past the window now, exactly when that man had stopped existing, or whether he'd ever really existed at all, and I'd simply built him out of the parts of Daniel that were convenient to fall in love with. That evening, Whitfield Development hosted a welcome dinner for its investors on the resort's terrace, strings of warm bulbs overhead, a jazz trio playing something soft near the bar, the harbor turning the color of a bruise as the sun went down behind it. I wore a pale blue dress I'd bought 2 years earlier and never had an occasion for, and I stood beside Daniel while he introduced me to a rotating cast of men in blazers who all seemed to know his golf handicap better than they knew my name. One of them, a heavy-set man named Frank Alvarez, who ran a regional distribution company and clearly considered himself an old family friend, took my hand warmly and told me I looked younger in person than in Daniel's photos. "He's always posting pictures of your cooking," Frank said. "Real homemaker, huh? Lucky guy." I smiled the smile I'd been perfecting since the airport and felt something sharp lodge itself just under my ribs. In the eyes of Daniel's friends, I understood now, with a clarity that hadn't been available to me an hour earlier. I had never been a person. I had been a backdrop, a set piece he photographed and captioned to build the image of a life he wanted his investors to believe he was living. The devoted husband, the successful man with the beautiful home and the beautiful wife who baked and gardened and asked for nothing. Halfway through dinner, Frank raised his glass toward Daniel and mentioned, in the casual way men mention things they don't realize are landmines, that he'd sent over the revised numbers for the Charleston waterfront parcel and that Vanessa had told him she'd handle the reconciliation directly with the finance team. No need to loop in the CFO this round. I watched Daniel's hand go still around the stem of his glass. Vanessa, 2 seats down, looked at her phone with sudden, intense focus. I set my water glass down gently on the white tablecloth, the way you set something down when you don't trust yourself to hold it steady a second longer. An executive assistant, reconciling multi-million-dollar project accounts directly with finance, bypassing the CFO. I committed the sentence to memory, the way I'd learned to commit things to memory over the years. Quietly, without letting my face register that anything worth remembering had just been said. That night, Daniel drank more than I'd seen him drink in a long time. Back in our room, he dropped onto the bed fully dressed and muttered into the pillow that I shouldn't make more of a mess out of things than there already was, that he could handle it, that I needed to trust him. I stood at the foot of the bed and looked down at him for a long moment. This was a man who spoke in absolutes when he was sober and let every seam show the second he wasn't. I opened the Suitcase file and typed a new line. Frank Alvarez. Vanessa reconciles Charleston project finances directly, no CFO oversight. Her role goes far beyond an assistance. I turned off the light and lay down at the far edge of the bed, listening to the ocean somewhere beyond the balcony doors, patient and rhythmic, like something that had all the time in the world to wait me out. I did not sleep well. I understood, lying there in the dark beside a man I no longer fully recognized, that the bracelet had only ever been the opening line of a much longer sentence, and that a sentence, once it starts, doesn't usually stop itself out of mercy. I woke before Daniel the next morning, an old habit from the early years of our marriage when his mother still lived with us for stretches and insisted a proper wife rose first. She'd moved back to Ohio years ago, but the habit had never quite left my body, a thread that refused to break even after the reason for it disappeared. I stepped out onto the balcony. The harbor at that hour was quieter than it would be by noon, gulls calling somewhere out past the marina, the air carrying a mineral, salt-heavy scent that woke you up gently instead of all at once. I stood there for a long time before going back inside to check my phone, careful not to wake Daniel, who slept on his side with his back to me, restless even in sleep, muttering fragments of things I couldn't make out. There had been a time, not so long ago, when I would have pulled the blanket up over his shoulder so he wouldn't get cold. That morning, I just looked at him and let it be. By 8, he was up, rubbing his temples, complaining about the number of scotches he'd had. I handed him a glass of water without being asked, an old reflex I hadn't managed to retire yet. He drank it in one go and told me he had a private meeting with a few key partners that afternoon, that I didn't need to come, that I should relax by the pool. I asked, in the most disinterested voice I could manage, whether Vanessa would be joining him. He hesitated for exactly half a second too long. Yeah, she's handling the paperwork. I didn't push further. There's no value in interrogating an answer you already know is only half true. Liars keep spare layers ready for exactly that kind of pressure, and pulling at them only burns your own time. After breakfast, Daniel and Vanessa left together for the meeting. I told them I was heading back to the room to rest, and instead lingered in the lobby a few extra minutes, watching them walk out through the glass doors toward the waiting car. Vanessa fell into step half a pace behind and to the side of him, and the distance between them wasn't the distance of a boss and an assistant. It was the distance of two people who had simply walked beside each other so many times that their bodies had learned the rhythm without either of them noticing. I went up to change into something simple and called a cab from the front desk. The driver asked where to. I thought about it for a second and told him to take me to whichever bank branch was nearest that handled Whitfield Development's accounts. He raised an eyebrow in the mirror but didn't ask questions, which I appreciated more than he probably realized. The bank sat on a busy corner a few blocks from the marina. Brick front, brass handles, the kind of building designed to look trustworthy without ever having to prove it. I took a number, waited, and when my turn came, I told the teller I wanted to confirm whether a specific account number belonged to their institution and slid my phone across the counter with a photo of the wire confirmation I'd found in the felt box. I explained, honestly, that I was Daniel Whitfield's wife and that this concerned a transfer from his company's project account. She looked uneasy, the way tellers always look when a request veers even slightly outside the script they've been trained on. Account information was confidential, she said. Without Mr. Whitfield's direct authorization, there was very little she could tell me. I'd expected exactly that answer. I'm not asking for a balance, I said. I don't need numbers. I just need to know whose name is attached to this account. She studied the photo a moment longer, looked back at me, and must have decided this fell somewhere outside her pay grade because she asked me to wait and disappeared through a door behind the counter. 10 minutes later, a man in his 50s who had the unmistakable bearing of a branch manager stepped out and invited me into a small private office off the main floor. He closed the door and, once it clicked shut, spoke to me with a directness I hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Whitfield, I know who you are. Your husband is one of our larger commercial clients. I told him I wasn't there to make trouble for anyone. I just needed a name. He was quiet for a moment, weighing something I could see cross his face in real time, and then he exhaled and told me. The account is under a Vanessa Cole. My pulse didn't even quicken. What I felt instead was a strange, hollow settling, the sensation of a final puzzle piece clicking into a picture that had already, on some level, resolved itself in my mind hours earlier. Does the account have any recorded ties to my husband's company beyond the one transfer I showed you? I asked. He didn't answer that directly, but he told me, in the careful language of someone who knows he's already said more than he should, that there had been several transfers over the last 3 months, none of them small, all originating from the same corporate account. I thanked him and left. I didn't go straight back to the resort. I walked for a while along the waterfront and found a quiet coffee shop a few blocks off the main strip, mostly empty at that hour, a few people hunched over laptops in the corner. I ordered black coffee and sat by the window and opened the Suitcase file. Account tied to the false bottom box belongs to Vanessa Cole. Multiple large transfers from Whitfield Development's corporate account over the past 3 months. I set the phone down and looked at the coffee in front of me, bitter and completely without pretense, which was more than I could say for anything else in my life at that moment. I sat there almost an hour, and I didn't cry, and I didn't call anyone. Some things only get more tangled if you say them out loud before you're ready to hold their full weight. Early that afternoon, I walked back into the resort lobby and saw Vanessa standing near the reception desk, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but sharp. I told you, don't call me right now. It's not safe here. Her back was to me. She hadn't seen me come in. I stayed a few feet away, not moving closer, not moving away, simply listening the way you listen when a sentence finally arrives that confirms every suspicion you've built out of scraps. A moment later, she hung up, turned, and startled visibly when she saw me standing there. Olivia, where'd you go? I told her I'd taken a walk to clear my head. She nodded, but her eyes had a brittleness to them that hadn't been there the day before. She started to say something else and stopped herself. Daniel's in the Magnolia conference room, she offered instead. He probably won't be free until this evening. I told her I already knew and walked off without asking anything further. The longer this went on, the more I understood that the things I needed weren't hiding in anyone's answers. They were hiding in the moments people weren't prepared for me to be standing there at all. That evening, Daniel came back to the room looking drained, but he still managed to summon a smile for me. Had I eaten? No. Let's go down, he said. He was starving. We sat across from each other in the resort's restaurant, candlelight, soft piano somewhere in the background, the entire scene arranged like a postcard of a happy marriage. He ordered for both of us without asking, the way he always did, an old habit I used to find charming and now recognized as simply another form of deciding things on my behalf without my input. I watched him for a while and then asked, casually, how many separate accounts Whitfield Development actually maintained? He paused, just slightly, before answering. Why do you ask? Just curious. A few, depending on the project, he said, and took a sip of water like the sentence had cost him nothing. I nodded and let it drop. He studied me a moment longer than necessary, sensing something shifting without being able to name exactly what. The dinner passed without a single raised voice. No accusations, nothing that would have looked, to any of the other diners around us, like anything other than a normal evening between a married couple on a business trip. But underneath the table, in the space between his silverware and mine, a distance had opened that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier, and it was growing, quietly, the way a crack in a foundation grows long before anyone notices the house has started to lean. That night, once Daniel had fallen asleep, I opened the suitcase file again and read through everything I'd written so far, top to bottom. Every line was flat, unembellished, just fact laid next to fact. I added one more before I let myself close my eyes. Daniel does not deny the money. He only avoids it. This has stopped being a misunderstanding. It is an active cover-up, and he knows I know. I lay there afterward, staring at the ceiling, understanding that I had arrived at a boundary line I couldn't uncross. On one side of it was silence, the version of my life where I kept playing the wife everyone at that dinner table believed they were looking at. On the other side was confrontation, which might cost me a great deal, but which was the only direction left in which I would still recognize myself when I looked in a mirror. The next morning, Daniel had another set of meetings, and I told him I planned to spend the day by the pool, which was true in the sense that I did sit by the pool, though not 1 minute of that time was spent relaxing. I called an old friend of my father's, a man everyone in my family has called Uncle Marcus since before I could walk, a corporate attorney who'd spent 30 years untangling exactly the kind of financial knots I now suspected Daniel of tying. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years, not since my father's funeral, and I felt a small stab of guilt reaching out to him only now that I needed something. He answered on the second ring anyway, his voice as steady and unhurried as I remembered. "Olivia, it's been too long. What's going on?" I told him in careful order everything I'd found. The bracelet, the false bottom, the wire confirmation, the account under Vanessa Cole's name, the pattern of transfers Frank Alvarez had let slip at dinner. Marcus listened without interrupting, the particular silence of a man who has heard 1,000 versions of this story and has learned that the worst thing you can do to a frightened woman on the phone is rush her. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Olivia, I want you to hear me clearly. If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just a marital problem anymore. This looks like your husband may be diverting corporate assets to an individual account, and depending on how it's structured, that could expose him to serious liability, both civil and potentially criminal. I need you to understand what that means before we go any further." "What do I do?" I asked. "First, tell me what you actually want. Do you want to save this marriage? Or do you want the truth, whatever it turns out to be? Because those two goals might not be compatible, and I need to know which one I'm helping you toward." I sat with that question longer than I expected to. The pool in front of me glittered under the Charleston sun, children shrieking somewhere near the shallow end, entirely unaware that 6 feet away, a woman was quietly deciding the shape of the rest of her life. "I don't want to keep living inside a marriage where I have to pretend I don't already know things," I said finally. "I think I've been doing that for longer than I realized." "Then here's what you need," Marcus said. "Comprehensive documentation. Everything you already have and everything you can still get, dated and organized. And second, you need to prepare yourself, honestly, for whatever the full picture turns out to be, because in my experience, it is very rarely as small as it looks on day one." He wasn't wrong. He had no idea that afternoon exactly how right he was going to turn out to be. I spent the rest of the day organizing what I had: screenshots of the wire confirmation, a photo of the bracelet and its receipt code, which I found stamped faintly on the felt lining and later matched through a jeweler's website to a boutique 2 blocks from Daniel's office. Notes from the bank manager's comments, dated and time-stamped in my phone. The overheard fragment of Vanessa's call, Frank Alvarez's comment at dinner, written out as close to word for word as I could reconstruct it. I laid it all out, digitally, and then, later that evening, on actual paper spread across the small desk in our hotel room, because something about seeing it physically arranged made it feel less like a suspicion and more like a case. Daniel walked in around 7 and stopped cold in the doorway when he saw the desk. "What is this?" "I'm putting things together," I said, not looking up. "Together how? Putting what together?" "Everything that connects you, Vanessa, and that money." The air in the room changed instantly, the way a room changes right before a storm breaks, pressure dropping all at once. He crossed to the desk and looked down at the papers without touching them, his jaw working. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "I'm looking at it exactly as it is," I said. "You don't trust me." "I used to," I said. "What did you do with that?" He didn't answer, which was, by that point, an answer in itself. "Vanessa isn't just an assistant," I continued, keeping my voice level even as my pulse climbed. "She's on a bank account tied to your company's funds. She's the name on a shell arrangement that's received tens of thousands of dollars from a project you told me lost money last year. How do you explain that?" "It's capital cycling," he said, the same phrase he'd used on the plane, worn smooth now from overuse. "It's more complicated than you think." "Then why is it running through her name and not yours?" He turned away toward the window, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. And in that silence I saw, for the first time in 6 years of marriage, something in Daniel Whitfield that looked almost like fear. Not of losing me, but of being fully seen. "I can't talk about this right now," he finally said. "Fine," I told him. "Then I will." We didn't sleep in the same bed that night. He took the small sofa near the balcony doors. I stayed in the bed, wide awake, listening to him toss for hours, before finally going still sometime after 2. I opened the suitcase file one last time before I let myself close my eyes. Confronted Daniel directly. He does not deny the account is Vanessa's. He cannot explain why. Marriage has reached the point where I need to decide, not just discover. I turned off the screen and lay in the dark, and outside the ocean kept doing what it always does, indifferent to how many marriages had ended, quietly or loudly, within sight of it. I woke before dawn again, the room quiet enough that I could hear Daniel's uneven breathing from the sofa. I lay there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the last 12 hours settle into something I could carry. Around 7, he stirred, sat up, and looked at me with an expression that had lost the polished confidence I'd known him by for 6 years. "You're up early," he said. "Yeah." A pause. "What are you doing today?" "I'm going to talk to Vanessa," I said. "Not necessary," he said quickly, standing, running a hand through his hair. "This is between you and me." "It stopped being only between you and me the moment her name went on that account," I said. "I need to hear it directly from her." "She won't tell you anything." "I don't need her to tell me everything," I said. "I just need to see how she says what she does say." He tried a few more times to talk me out of it, his voice climbing slightly before he caught himself and brought it back down, aware, I think, that raised voices in a hotel room were the last thing his image could survive right now. I got dressed anyway. Before I left, I told him, "If you actually want to fix any part of this, today's the last day I'll be interested in the truth voluntarily. After today, I stop asking and start finding things out on my own." He didn't answer. He stood at the window with his back to me, and I let the door close quietly behind me. I didn't call Vanessa. I went straight to the conference wing where I knew she'd be prepping materials for the afternoon session, and found her in a small office just off the main hall, a stack of folders in front of her, tapping away at a laptop. She looked up when I knocked and her whole posture changed, shoulders rising toward her ears, color draining slightly from her face. "Olivia." I closed the door behind me and sat down across from her without being invited to. "You know why I'm here," I said. She looked down at her hands. I let the silence stretch, because I had learned by then that people fill silence with truth faster than they fill it with anything you ask them directly. Finally, in a voice that had lost all of its dinner party polish, she said, "It's not what you think." "I haven't told you what I think," I said. "I'm asking you to tell me what it is." Her hands were shaking slightly where they gripped the edge of the desk. "I was just doing what Daniel told me to do," she said. "He asked me to let him route some funds through an account in my name. He said it was temporary, for the project, that it would look cleaner that way for the investors." "Cleaner for the investors, or cleaner for him?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, and when she finally looked up at me, there was something in her expression I hadn't expected. Not defiance. Not the guilty defensiveness of a woman caught with another woman's husband. It looked, more than anything, like exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just been asked, for the first time, whether she wanted to keep carrying it. "Olivia, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "There's nothing romantic between me and Daniel. I know how this looks. I know exactly how it looks. But I've never—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, and I watched her decide, in real time, whether to keep protecting a man who very clearly was not protecting her back. "About 18 months ago, I made a mistake at my last job. A serious one. Money went missing from an account I managed, and it was never fully resolved before I left. Daniel found out about it during my background check. He never reported it. He never even confronted me directly about it. He just started, very slowly, asking me for small favors. Sign this. Hold this account for a month. Don't mention this transfer to finance. And every time I hesitated, he'd remind me, very gently, that he still had the paperwork from my old job sitting in a drawer somewhere, and that all it would take was one email. I sat very still, feeling the shape of the story I thought I'd been building shift underneath me, like a floor I'd trusted turning out to be a stage set. "So the bracelet," I said slowly, "it wasn't for you." Vanessa let out a short, humorless laugh. "God, no. I didn't even know about the bracelet until it showed up on the airport floor in front of 40 people. I have no idea whose it was supposed to be. I just knew my name was on the account it was tied to, and that whatever it was going to blow up in my face along with everything else, because that's how it's always worked with him. I take the risk, he keeps his hands clean." The room felt suddenly very small. "Then whose bracelet is it?" I said, not really a question, more a thought escaping out loud. And Vanessa looked at me with an expression I would spend a long time afterward trying to name, somewhere between pity and relief that she wasn't the one who had to say it. "I don't know for certain," she said carefully. "But there's a woman who's been coming to the Charleston site walkthroughs for the last 4 months, Sophia Bennett. She's the interior design consultant on the waterfront project. Daniel's been taking calls from her that he steps out of the room for. I've booked hotel charges under project codes that don't match any actual line item. I assumed, honestly, that you already suspected her, since you've been asking about everything else. I had never heard the name Sophia Bennett in my life. I don't remember exactly how I got out of that office. I remember thanking Vanessa, which felt strange even as I said it. Thanking a woman who had helped hide money from me for over a year. But some instinct in me recognized that whatever else she was also a person who had just handed me the truth at real risk to herself. And that deserved something, even if I wasn't sure yet what. She caught my arm gently before I reached the door. "For what it's worth," she said. "I'm sorry. I should have said something a long time ago. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business to blow up someone else's marriage. I think I just didn't want to admit I was already part of blowing it up." I walked out into the resort hallway and stood there for a moment, feeling strangely untethered, the way you feel after a car accident, when your body is still moving but your mind hasn't caught up to what just happened to it. Everything I'd built the suitcase file around for 2 days had just been quietly, completely reorganized. Not a lie disproven, a lie relocated. I had been so certain, so entirely certain, that the story ended with Vanessa, that I had never once considered there might be a second woman standing behind her, using her the exact same way Daniel had used me, as cover. I found a bench near the marina and sat down, opened my phone, and searched the name Sophia Bennett alongside Whitfield Development. It took less than a minute. A polished professional website came up first, an interior design studio based in Charleston, portfolio full of exactly the kind of coastal, luxury aesthetic Whitfield's waterfront project would want to be photographed in front of. Her bio mentioned she'd relocated to Charleston 2 years earlier from Atlanta. A handful of local press photos showed her at a ribbon cutting for another development, laughing beside a man I didn't recognize. And then, 3 photos down, at a groundbreaking ceremony for the Whitfield waterfront parcel, standing just slightly too close to Daniel, his hand resting at the small of her back in a gesture I recognized immediately, because it was the exact gesture he'd used on me the week he told me I didn't need to work anymore. I sat with that for a long time before I opened the suitcase file again. Sophia Bennett, Interior Design Consultant, Charleston Waterfront Project. Vanessa says calls and hotel charges under mismatched project codes traced to her, not to Vanessa. I paused, then added one more line. Vanessa was never the affair. She was the decoy. I built an entire theory around the wrong woman for 3 straight days, and he let me. That last thought sat heaviest of all. It wasn't only that Daniel had betrayed me with someone. It was that he had, whether by accident or by design, let me spend 2 exhausting, gut-wrenching days pouring every ounce of suspicion and grief I had into the wrong target, while the real one walked freely through every meeting I'd sat across from her in, without my even knowing to look at her twice. I went back to my hotel room, showered, and sat by the window for an hour trying to decide what to do with what I now knew. Marcus called that evening to check in, and when I told him what Vanessa had said, his voice sharpened in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "Olivia, listen to me carefully. If your husband is directing project funds toward a personal relationship and using an employee's account to obscure it, that isn't just infidelity anymore. Depending on how those hotel charges and project codes were structured, that could be fraud against his own investors. And if Frank Alvarez or anyone else on that project ever finds out the numbers don't reconcile the way they were told, it becomes a legal problem that has absolutely nothing to do with your marriage and everything to do with keeping him out of serious trouble. You need everything documented, and you need it documented before he has a chance to clean any of it up. I spent that night doing exactly that. I photographed every note, screenshotted every search result, wrote down every detail Vanessa had told me while it was still fresh enough to be precise. Daniel didn't return to the room until close to 11, and when he did, he found me at the desk again, papers spread in front of me, though this time I didn't bother hiding what I was looking at on my laptop screen. Sophia Bennett's design portfolio, open to the photo of her at the groundbreaking, his hand at her back. He stopped in the doorway and went very still. I met with Vanessa today, I said without looking up. Olivia. She told me everything about the account, about how you found out something from her old job and used it to keep her quiet and compliant for over a year. I finally looked up at him. And she told me about Sophia. Daniel's face did something I had never seen it do before in 6 years of marriage. It didn't tighten into the careful, controlled mask he wore for difficult conversations. It simply fell apart, all at once. The way a poorly built wall does when you finally lean your full weight against the one spot that was never load-bearing. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. I waited. I had gotten good over the past 3 days at waiting. It started about 8 months ago, he finally said, his voice stripped of every ounce of its usual polish. Sophia came on to consult on the waterfront interiors. It wasn't supposed to be anything. I don't even have a good explanation for you, Olivia. Other than that, it just kept happening. And every time I told myself it would be the last time, and it never was. And the money, I said, was that also just something that kept happening? He rubbed his face with both hands. The project actually did lose money last year. That part was true. But not $1.5 million. Closer to 600,000. I told the investors the bigger number so I'd have room to move funds without anyone questioning the smaller discrepancies. Some of it went to Sophia, directly. Consulting fees that were inflated past what she actually billed. Some of it went into a property. Something in my chest went very cold. What property? He wouldn't look at me for a moment, and when he did, his eyes had the particular flatness of a man who has run out of ways to soften something. A condo, downtown, near the marina. I put the down payment through Vanessa's account so it wouldn't trace directly back to me. And I put the deed in Sophia's name because... He stopped. Because if it traced back to you, it would look exactly like what it is, I finished for him. He didn't argue. How much? I said. The total. Not the number you told the investors. The real one. He was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer at all. A little over $380,000. Across everything. The bracelet, the condo down payment, consulting overages, hotel charges I ran through project codes. I sat down in the chair across from him, my legs suddenly unwilling to hold me up on their own. $380,000 of marital and company money funneled quietly out of our life and into someone else's, while I sat at home for 6 years believing I was being taken care of. Does Sophia know you're married? I asked, because it seemed, suddenly, like the only remaining question whose answer I actually needed. She knows, he said quietly. She's known the whole time. Is she pregnant? I asked. I don't fully know where the question came from, except that some instinct, some old and tired intuition, told me the story wasn't finished revealing itself yet, and I would rather hear the worst of it now in one sitting than in installments over the coming weeks. Daniel's silence answered before his voice did. 14 weeks, he said finally. I found out 3 weeks ago. That's part of why the condo happened so fast. I panicked. I wanted somewhere for her that wasn't connected to anything that could come back on the company or on us. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something strange happen inside my chest. Not quite grief and not quite rage. Something closer to a door quietly closing on a room I would never walk back into. I had spent 6 years of my life inside a marriage where I had no income, no title to our home in my own name, no visibility into a single account that mattered, all under the argument that a woman married to a successful man had no need to concern herself with such things. And in that same 6 years, without my knowledge, my husband had built an entire second life out of the very resources that marriage had denied me access to. I need you to understand something, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. I am not angry right now because you fell in love with someone else. People fall in and out of love. That happens, even in marriages that started out honest. I am angry because you built an entire architecture of lies to make sure I would never have the information I needed to protect myself, financially or otherwise, while you did it. That's not an affair, Daniel. That's a plan. He didn't try to argue. He just sat there, elbows on his knees, looking, for the first time since I'd married him, like a man who had run completely out of room to maneuver. What happens now? He asked, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Now, I said. I finished documenting everything, and I let Marcus decide what the smartest legal path forward looks like. And you are going to sleep on that sofa until we're back in Denver, because I genuinely do not know yet whether I can be in the same bed as you without wanting to burn the sheets. The last day of the summit passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Daniel kept his public composure for the investor sessions, shaking hands, delivering his closing remarks about the waterfront project's renewed timeline with the same effortless charm he'd always had. And I sat in the third row of folding chairs and watched him do it, understanding for the first time how much of that charm had always been performance rather than personality. Vanessa avoided my eyes for most of the day, though at one point, passing me near the coffee station, she said quietly, I hope you get everything you need out of this. And I believed she meant it. Frank Alvarez cornered me near the closing reception, a little looser from the wine, and asked, half joking, whether everything was all right because Daniel had seemed off his game the past couple of days. I told him Daniel was just tired from the travel, which was true in its own limited way, and Frank laughed and said travel would do that to a man, and moved on to compliment someone's boat. I remember thinking, watching him walk away, that Frank had no idea he was one loose thread away from discovering his own money had been quietly diverted to cover a mistress's mortgage, and that the thread was currently sitting 3 feet away from him in a pale blue dress, deciding exactly how and when to pull it. I called Marcus again that night from the hotel bathroom, running the shower so Daniel on the sofa wouldn't overhear. I told him everything Daniel had confessed, the real project loss versus the reported one, the condo, the pregnancy, the total figure. Marcus was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Olivia, I need to say something to you plainly, and I need you to really hear it. What you're describing now goes beyond a marriage falling apart. If Daniel misrepresented losses to investors to create room to divert those funds, that's investor fraud, on top of whatever this means for your divorce. You are not obligated to protect him from the consequences of that, and frankly, Given what he's already done to protect himself at your expense, I don't think you owe him the effort. I'm not trying to protect him, I said. I just don't know yet what I'm trying to do. Then let's start with what's yours, Marcus said, in the calm, methodical voice I remembered from childhood. The same voice he'd used explaining why the sky was blue when I was 7. Tomorrow, once you're back in Denver, come to my office. We'll go through the house, the accounts, everything, with both your names on it and everything that should have your name on it and doesn't. We build the divorce case in parallel with documenting the financial misconduct because you may need both, and you may need them to move at different speeds. I thanked him and hung up and sat on the edge of the bathtub for a while, listening to the water run, thinking about how strange it was that the man helping me dismantle my marriage with the most care was someone who had known me since before I could tie my own shoes, while the man I'd built that marriage with for 6 years had never once, not even that night, apologized without immediately following it with an explanation designed to soften how it made him look. We flew back to Denver the next afternoon. Daniel and I sat beside each other on the plane in a silence that had nothing performative left in it, no audience to maintain it for anymore. Vanessa had a separate flight. I never learned if that was her choice or his. Somewhere over Georgia, Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant, a register I had genuinely never heard from him before. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix any of it. No, I agreed. It doesn't. I still am, though, he said, for what it's worth. I looked out the window at the clouds again, the same white, deceptively solid clouds from 3 days earlier, and thought about how much had changed underneath them without their shape ever once shifting. I believe that you're sorry you got caught, I said finally. I'm not sure yet if I believe you're sorry for what you did. Those are 2 very different things, Daniel, and I think you've spent your whole life treating them like they're the same. He didn't argue. He just looked down at his hands, and we didn't speak again for the rest of the flight. I didn't go home right away once we landed in Denver. I asked the driver to take me to my mother's house in Boulder instead, a small blue bungalow with a porch swing my father had built the summer before he got sick. And I sat in her kitchen while she made tea neither of us drank and told her, in the plainest words I could find, that my marriage was over. She listened without interrupting, the way she'd always listened to hard things, and when I finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Are you sure?" she said, not as a challenge, just as a question that needed to be asked once out loud before it could become a decision. "I've never been more sure of anything," I told her. "Then I'm not going to spend a single minute trying to talk you out of it," she said. "I raised you to know your own mind. I just wish it hadn't cost you this much to use it." She was quiet for a moment, turning her mug slowly on the table. "Your father always said Daniel had a good handshake and a bad habit of looking at people like they were problems to be managed instead of people to be known. I told him he was being unfair. I think, now, he might have just been paying better attention than I was." I stayed the night at her house, sleeping in my childhood bedroom under a ceiling still faintly patterned with the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck up there at age 11. And in the morning, I drove to Marcus's office downtown, where he'd already begun assembling what he called, without any humor in his voice, the file. We spent 4 hours going through everything. The deed to our house, which was in Daniel's name alone, a fact I hadn't fully registered the significance of until Marcus explained, patiently, that in a community property state, my claim to it was still strong regardless of whose name was on the paperwork, but that having it be his name only had certainly made things easier for him to maneuver around me. We went through retirement accounts, the small joint checking accounts I'd used for groceries and little else, and the much larger accounts I had never once been given access to, in a marriage where I had, technically, worked unpaid as a household manager for 6 full years. "You're entitled to a great deal more than you probably think you are," Marcus told me. "Colorado courts don't look kindly on one spouse deliberately excluding another from financial visibility, especially not when there's evidence, like what you've collected, of active concealment. And separately," he added more carefully, "given what you've told me about the misrepresented project losses, I think you should also consider whether you have an obligation, not a legal one necessarily, but a moral one, to make sure Frank Alvarez and the other investors eventually learn what actually happened to their money. That's a decision only you can make. I won't push you either way. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't ask you to think about it." I did think about it, for a long time in the weeks that followed. I want to be honest and say I didn't come to a clean, satisfying answer immediately. Part of me wanted to let Daniel's business collapse under the weight of its own dishonesty, without my having to lift a finger. And part of me understood that dozens of people who had never wronged me, junior employees, subcontractors, even Vanessa, who despite everything had ultimately told me the truth when she didn't have to, stood to lose their livelihoods if Whitfield Development came apart entirely and publicly. In the end, I gave Marcus permission to share what we had with the securities attorney Frank Alvarez's firm brought in independently. Once whispers had already started circulating through the investor group about irregularities in the Charleston numbers. I never had to be the one to say it out loud in a boardroom. The truth, once it starts moving, tends to find its own way to the surface, the same way it had found its way out of a suitcase on an ordinary Tuesday night in April. Daniel called his mother the same week I told mine. She called me 2 days later, her voice thin and tired in a way I had never heard from a woman who had always struck me as formidable, even a little intimidating. "I don't know what to say to you, Olivia," she told me. "I raised him better than this. I don't know where it went wrong." I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I didn't think it was her job to apologize for choices that were entirely her son's to make, and that whatever had gone wrong, it hadn't happened because of anything she failed to teach him. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that stayed with me. "You were always too good for the version of him that made all these decisions. I think some part of me always knew that and didn't want to say it, because it's easier to hope your son will grow into the man you raised him to be than to admit he's already decided not to." I never met Sophia Bennett in person, not properly. I saw her once, from a distance, in the parking lot of a title company downtown, the week Daniel's lawyer finally arranged for the condo deed to be renegotiated as part of the larger financial settlement. She was further along by then, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, and for a moment our eyes met across the lot, and I watched something complicated pass over her face. Not quite guilt, and not quite defiance. Something closer to the exhaustion of a woman who had also, in her own way, been managed by a man skilled at making people believe they were choosing things he had actually already decided for them. I didn't approach her. There was nothing left I needed from her directly, and whatever reckoning she owed herself wasn't mine to collect. I've thought about her since, more than I expected to. I hope, for the sake of the child who had no part in any of this, that she finds her way to something steadier than what she started with. Vanessa, for her part, cooperated fully once the securities attorney got involved, providing documentation that ultimately protected her from the worst of the fallout, given that she'd acted under duress rather than personal gain. She left Whitfield Development within the month, and I heard through a mutual acquaintance about a year later, landed a compliance role at a firm in Austin. The kind of job, I imagine, where nobody will ever again be able to hold an old mistake over her head quite so easily. I don't know if we'll ever speak again. I don't know that we need to, but I've never regretted, even once, the fact that I thanked her that day in the conference office instead of simply walking out. 2 weeks after we returned from Charleston, I sat Daniel down at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd once told me a woman married to a successful man had no need to struggle out there, and told him it was time to finalize things properly. He put down the mug he'd been holding and looked at me for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "I've thought about it enough," I said. "I've made my decision. I want a divorce." He didn't argue. He didn't look surprised either, which told me he'd already arrived somewhere close to the same conclusion on his own. He just nodded slowly and said, "I understand." "I'm not doing this out of anger," I told him, and I meant it, because by then the anger had mostly burned down into something quieter and more permanent, closer to certainty than to heat. "I'm doing it because I know that if we kept going, neither of us would ever get to live an honest life again." "I know I don't have any right to ask you to stay," he said. "You don't," I agreed. "And I don't need you to ask. I just need this to be finished." We spoke for a while longer about logistics, timelines, how we'd handle the house until things were settled, and the conversation had none of the shouting I once might have imagined a moment like this would require. It had, instead, the particular stillness of two people setting down something heavy they had both, in different ways, been carrying for far too long. "Thank you for being direct with me," he said near the end. "It's the least I could do for both of us," I told him, and I realized, saying it, that I meant that too. That night, I packed a suitcase in our bedroom, the same suitcase whose hidden compartment had started all of this 3 weeks earlier. Folding my clothes into it, I found myself almost laughing at the strange symmetry of it. The exact object that had cracked my marriage open, now serving as the object I'd used to carry myself out of it. Life has a way of closing its own circles, whether or not you ask it to. I woke the next morning to find Daniel already gone, a note left on the kitchen island. "Gone to see Marcus's counterpart about the settlement paperwork. Stay as long as you need. Call if you need anything." I read it twice, folded it, and didn't call. I drove instead to my mother's house for the day, and when I came back that evening, Daniel was home, and he saw the packed suitcase sitting by the front door and asked no questions about it at all. "Did you tell your mother the timeline?" he asked instead. "I did," I said. "She's already made peace with it. What about your mother?" "She's devastated," he said. "But she doesn't blame you. She never has, not really." I wasn't surprised. Beneath everything, his mother had always struck me as a fundamentally decent woman who had simply run out of ways to excuse her son. We sat together a while longer, talking very little, because there was nothing left worth debating and nothing left worth trying to salvage. "Take care of yourself, Olivia," he said finally. I looked at him, and something in my chest, unexpectedly, softened just slightly, not into forgiveness, but into something adjacent to it, the recognition that two people who had once genuinely loved each other could still, even at the end of everything, wish each other something simple and true. "You too," I said. I didn't sleep in our bedroom that last night. I lay on the living room sofa, staring up at a ceiling that had watched 6 years of my life unfold beneath it, and understood, lying there, that I was no longer the woman who waited quietly in the dark for someone else to decide what her life would look like. I was the woman who had opened a suitcase on an ordinary Tuesday and refused, from that moment forward, to look away from what she found inside it. The next morning, I rolled my suitcase to the front door. Daniel stood in the hallway and made no move to stop me. "I'm leaving," I said. "I know," he said quietly. I opened the door and stepped out into a bright, clear Denver morning, the mountains sharp against the sky in the particular way they only are after a hard rain, and I didn't look back. Not because I'd stopped caring what happened to him, but because I understood, finally, that once you've walked all the way through a door like that one, there's nothing behind you left worth turning around for. I want to go back for a moment because I skipped past something in the telling that deserves its own space. The 6 weeks between the day I gave Marcus permission to share our documentation with Frank Alvarez's securities attorney and the day the full picture became public knowledge within Whitfield Development's investor circle. I wasn't in the room for most of it, by design and by choice, but I heard enough, through Marcus and through the occasional, increasingly uncomfortable phone call from Daniel's mother, to understand roughly how it unfolded. The securities attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Patricia Nguyen, spent the better part of a month tracing every transfer Daniel had routed through Vanessa's account and cross-referencing it against the numbers his firm had reported to investors. What she found wasn't just the $380,000 Daniel had confessed to me in that Charleston hotel room. It was closer to $520,000 once every inflated invoice and misdirected consulting fee was accounted for, stretching back nearly 2 years, well before Sophia Bennett had ever walked onto a Whitfield job site. Some of it turned out, had gone toward an earlier arrangement entirely. A woman in Denver named Kristen, who Daniel had apparently been seeing on and off since before our 5th anniversary, quietly ended a few months before Sophia arrived on the scene, but never actually accounted for in any of the company's books. I remember sitting in Marcus's office the day he told me that part, feeling strangely calm. The way you feel calm about news that can no longer really surprise you, because you've already spent your capacity for shock on an earlier, smaller version of the same story. "How long had you suspected there might be more than what you found in Charleston?" Marcus asked me gently. "I don't think I let myself suspect it," I told him honestly. I think some part of me needed to believe the Charleston version was the whole story, because the alternative meant admitting I'd been not just deceived, but deceived for years by a pattern I never once picked up on. Frank Alvarez, when he finally learned the truth, did not react the way I expected. I had pictured him furious, threatening lawsuits, the kind of loud, wounded pride anger men like him are known for when their money is involved. Instead, according to Marcus, he was mostly quiet, and then, a few days later, he called me directly, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that spring. "Olivia," he said when I picked up, "I owe you an apology, and I don't say that easily." "You don't owe me anything, Frank," I told him. "I sat across from you at that dinner in Charleston and told you what a great homemaker you were, like you were a piece of furniture Daniel had picked out," he said. "I've been turning that over in my head for weeks now. I knew Daniel a long time, Olivia. I trusted him with real money. And it turns out I trusted him a lot more than I ever bothered trusting you. And you were the only person at that table who actually had the full picture the whole time. That doesn't sit right with me." I told him I appreciated him saying so, and I meant it, though I also understood, quietly, that his apology, however sincere, was really about his own money and his own misplaced trust as much as it was about me. That's all right. Not every act of decency has to be pure to still matter. Frank went on to lead the push among the investor group to remove Daniel from any operational control of the waterfront project while the fraud allegations were investigated, and eventually to force a full buyout of his stake in the company he had built from nothing, at a valuation far below what it would have commanded a year earlier, before his name became attached, in certain Denver business circles, to a story everyone half knew and nobody wanted to say out loud at dinner. Whitfield Development still exists, technically, under new leadership, a cousin of Frank's who Daniel had once dismissed at a company barbecue as not sharp enough for this business. I heard, secondhand, that the waterfront project finished on time and, ironically, under budget, once someone else was finally allowed to look honestly at the numbers. Daniel was never criminally charged, Patricia Nguyen explained to Marcus, and Marcus explained to me that the structuring of the transfers, while deeply unethical and clearly designed to mislead investors, fell into a gray area that prosecutors, weighing time and resources, chose not to pursue, given that a substantial civil settlement had already been reached and the investors themselves, Frank chief among them, preferred a quiet resolution over a public trial that would have dragged their own due diligence failures into daylight alongside Daniel's fraud. I won't pretend I didn't feel a flicker of something bitter about that. Watching a man walk away from years of calculated deception with nothing worse than a diminished bank account and a reputation that would eventually, given enough time and enough new business cards, probably recover in rooms far away from Denver. But I also understood by then that my peace could not be built on the foundation of his punishment. If it depended on watching him suffer in some specific, satisfying way, I would have handed him power over my life all over again, just in a different shape than before. The divorce itself took 4 months to finalize, longer than I expected, shorter than Marcus had warned me it might. Because of the financial misconduct documentation we'd assembled, and because Daniel, by that point, had very little appetite left for a public fight that would only invite more scrutiny into his business dealings, the settlement negotiations moves faster than most contested divorces do. I walked away with the house, which surprised me, until Marcus explained that Daniel's attorney had recommended he concede it quickly and quietly, rather than risk a judge hearing the full story of how the marriage had actually operated for 6 years. I sold it within 3 months. I didn't want to live inside a floor plan that still held the shape of a version of myself I no longer recognized, walking through rooms where I'd once believed a man's silence about money was a form of protection instead of a form of control. I used part of the settlement, along with money I'd quietly saved from an inheritance my grandmother left me years before I met Daniel, an account he never once asked about because he'd assumed, correctly, that I wouldn't think to hide anything from him, to put a down payment on a small 2-bedroom condo near the Highlands, close enough to my mother that I could see her without planning a whole day around it, far enough from our old neighborhood that I stopped running into people who still called me Daniel Whitfield's wife, like it was the most interesting thing about me. The harder part, honestly, wasn't the house or the money. It was figuring out who I was supposed to be at 34, 6 years removed from the last time I'd built anything with my own hands, rather than simply maintaining a home someone else had built around me. I hadn't touched design software in years. My portfolio, when I finally opened the old files on a laptop I'd nearly forgotten I owned, felt like looking at work made by a stranger, competent but unfinished, a career interrupted mid-sentence the way a conversation gets interrupted by someone deciding, on your behalf, that you're done talking. I spent that first summer after the divorce slowly rebuilding it. I took an online certification course to catch up on everything the industry had changed in 6 years, which turned out to be nearly everything. I reached out to my old agency, not expecting much, and found that my former creative director, a woman named Priya, who'd always liked my instincts more than my confidence, remembered me warmly and offered to bring me on as a freelance contractor for a rebrand project while I found my footing again. That first project, a small nonprofit's visual identity redesign, paid me less in 3 months than Daniel used to spend on a single business trip. I have never in my life been prouder of a paycheck. Renee, my best friend, the one I'd texted a photo of the bracelet without explanation on that first strange night, showed up at my new condo the week I moved in with a bottle of wine and a housewarming plant she promptly admitted she had no idea how to keep alive. We sat on the floor because I didn't own a couch yet, and she asked me, gently, how I was really doing. Not the version of the answer I gave everyone else. Some days I feel like I got my whole life handed back to me, I told her. And some days I feel furious that I ever had to earn back something that should have always been mine to begin with. Both of those can be true at the same time, she said. And I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count since. By the following spring, almost exactly a year after that Tuesday night on my bedroom floor, I had a full client roster, a small but steady stream of freelance work that was, slowly, turning into something like a real practice again. I hired an accountant, my own, someone who answered only to me, and the first time she walked me through my own financial statements, actual numbers with my actual name attached to accounts I actually controlled, I sat in her office afterward for a long moment before I could bring myself to leave, feeling something settle into place that I hadn't realized had been missing for 6 years. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Something more foundational than that. The simple, previously unfamiliar sensation of standing on ground that belonged entirely to me. I ran into Daniel by accident the following June at a farmer's market near my new condo, of all the mundane places our lives could have crossed again. I saw him before he saw me, standing at a stall buying peaches, wearing a linen shirt I didn't recognize, looking thinner than I remembered, a little grayer at the temples. For a second, I considered turning down a different aisle and letting the moment pass unclaimed. Then he looked up, and it was too late. And something in his face shifted through surprise and then into a kind of careful, guarded politeness neither of us had ever really needed with each other before all of this. Olivia. He said my name like he wasn't sure he still had the right to. Daniel. I nodded toward the peaches. Those any good? Better than the ones from the place on Colfax, he said. And for just a moment, standing there in the sun with a paper bag of fruit between us, it felt almost like a normal exchange between two people who used to know each other well, before either of us remembered everything underneath it. We talked for a few minutes, the surface kind of talking people do when there's an entire ocean of things neither of them wants to open up in a public market. He told me he'd taken a smaller role at a friend's development firm in Colorado Springs, starting over in a much quieter way than he was used to. He asked, carefully, how I was doing, and I told him, honestly, that I was doing well, that I had my own client roster now, my own name on my own invoices. Something crossed his face when I said that, and I couldn't quite tell if it was regret or something closer to respect, arriving a few years too late to matter the way it might have once. I think about it a lot, he said finally, apropos of nothing I'd asked him. What I actually threw away. I don't think I understood, while I was doing it, that I was choosing something smaller than what I already had. I just didn't know how to sit still inside a life that was already good enough. I didn't say anything for a moment, turning that over. I don't need you to explain it to me anymore, Daniel, I said, not unkindly. I spent a long time needing to understand why. I don't anymore. It doesn't change anything now, and honestly, I think I've made more peace with the unanswered version of it than I would have with whatever explanation you could give me. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer and had made some kind of peace with it himself. I heard about your business, he said. Priya mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to my mother. Sounds like it's going well. It is, I said simply, and left it there, because I didn't owe him the fuller version. The late nights building a client base back up from nothing, the fear of the first empty month with no incoming work, the slow, grinding satisfaction of watching a bank balance grow because of decisions I alone had made. I'm glad, he said, and I believed in that moment, standing in a farmer's market on an ordinary June morning, that he actually was. It didn't undo anything. It didn't need to. Some conversations aren't for repair. They're just for closing a door gently instead of slamming it, which, I've come to think, is its own kind of mercy, even when it isn't strictly deserved. We said an easy enough goodbye, and I watched him walk off toward the parking lot with his peaches, and I stood there for a moment longer, waiting to feel something enormous, grief or anger or vindication, and found instead that I mostly just felt like a woman standing in a farmer's market on a warm morning, with a list of vegetables still to buy and a client call at 2. The absence of any dramatic feeling was, itself, the clearest evidence I had that I'd actually healed, in the quiet, undramatic way healing usually happens. Not in one cathartic scene, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary mornings where a person who once controlled the weather of your entire life simply becomes someone you ran into once, buying fruit. It was around that same time, sitting on my mother's porch swing on a Sunday afternoon, with 2 glasses of iced tea sweating rings onto the wood between us, that she finally told me something about her own marriage to my father that she'd never mentioned in 34 years of raising me. There was a woman once, she said, watching a hummingbird work over the feeder she kept refilling long after my father was gone. Before you were born. It lasted about 6 months. I found out because a friend of mine saw them together at a restaurant in Denver and felt obligated to tell me, the way people always seem to feel obligated at exactly the wrong moment. She said it so plainly, so without drama, that it took me a second to fully register what she'd told me. You never told me that, I said. There was never a reason to, she said. It ended. He came to me on his own, before I even confronted him and told me the truth. And I made a choice, which was to stay, on the condition that I would never again be a woman who didn't know what was happening in her own life. I opened every account. I asked every question. He let me, because I think some part of him understood he'd earned that, and he spent the rest of his life proving to me it wouldn't happen again. She looked at me then, and her eyes were steady in a way I recognized, the same steadiness I'd been trying to build in myself for the past year. I'm not telling you this to say you should have stayed, Olivia. Daniel is not your father, and what he did wasn't a 6-month lapse in an otherwise honest marriage. It was a structure he built on purpose, over years, and there's no version of staying that would have fixed that, because the problem was never the affair. The problem was that he never once believed you deserved to know the truth about your own life. Then why tell me now? I asked. Because I want you to understand something, she said. A marriage surviving isn't automatically proof it was healthy, and a marriage ending isn't automatically proof it failed. What matters is whether both people inside it were ever really allowed to see clearly. Your father let me see clearly, eventually, even though it cost him something to do it. Daniel never did. That's the entire difference. and it's the only one that actually matters. I sat with that for a long time after she said it, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you've walked past 100 times without ever really looking at. I had spent so much of the past year quietly comparing my situation to some imagined standard of what a real betrayal looked like, wondering if I was overreacting, if other women managed to survive worse and stay, if there was something almost dramatic or self-indulgent about how completely I had let one bracelet in a suitcase reorganize my entire life. My mother's story didn't hand me permission exactly. I didn't need permission by that point. But it handed me something almost as valuable. Proof that the difference between a marriage worth fighting for and one worth walking away from was never really about the size of the betrayal. It was about whether the person on the other side of it was capable of finally, fully letting you see. I didn't date for almost a year after the divorce was finalized. Not out of any grand principle, just because I genuinely didn't have the appetite for it. Renee tried, gently and then not so gently, to get me to download one app or another. And I kept putting it off, telling her I needed to finish rebuilding my client base first, which was true, but wasn't the whole truth. The fuller truth was that I was afraid of what it would mean about me if I fell for the same kind of charm twice. The easy confidence, the man who always knew exactly what to say, because that was precisely the profile that had gotten me into 6 years of not knowing my own bank balance in the first place. When I did finally meet someone, it happened in the most unremarkable way possible, through Priya, who introduced me to her husband's college roommate at a small dinner she threw for no particular occasion. His name was Theo. He ran a small woodworking business out of a shop in Golden, made custom furniture, mostly, and had a habit, I noticed within the first 20 minutes of meeting him, of asking questions and then actually wading through the entire answer before responding, instead of using the time to plan what he'd say next. It unsettled me at first, how little performance there was in it. I had forgotten, apparently, that conversations were allowed to be that simple. We didn't move quickly. I told him on our third date, sitting at a small taco place neither of us had been to before, most of what had happened with Daniel. Not because I owed him a confession, but because I didn't want to build anything new on a foundation of things left unsaid. The exact mistake I'd spent 6 years living inside of without realizing it. He listened without flinching, without offering the kind of performative outrage some people reach for to prove they're on your side. And at the end, he said only, "That sounds like it took a long time to walk yourself out of. I'm glad you did." It was such a small thing to say, and it meant more to me than almost anything anyone had said to me in the 2 years before it. I'm not going to tell you Theo fixed anything, because that's not how any of this works. And I'd be doing every woman reading or listening to this a disservice if I pretended a good man showing up eventually was the actual resolution to what I went through. The resolution had already happened, months earlier, alone, on a bedroom floor, and then in a Charleston hotel room, and then in Marcus's office going through account statements line by line. Theo didn't repair me. He simply arrived, later, into a life I had already finished rebuilding on my own terms, and had the good sense to recognize it was worth being careful with. I think often about that first unanswered text I sent Renee, the photo of the bracelet with no explanation attached, and the way I let her worry sit there unaddressed for hours while I decided what shape my own feelings needed to take before I could hand them to anyone else. I've since asked her what that night was like from her side of the phone, and she told me she nearly drove to my house at midnight, that she sat awake until almost 2 a.m. refreshing her messages, terrified something had happened to me, and unsure whether showing up uninvited would help or make things worse. "Why didn't you just come over?" I asked her. "Because I know you," she said. "I know that when something actually breaks you, you go quiet first, and you need the quiet before you need anyone else." I hated it. I hated sitting there doing nothing. But I trusted that you'd tell me when you were ready, and I decided that trusting you mattered more than my own panic. That, I think, more than almost anything else in this whole story, is the difference between the people who actually loved me and the people who only ever managed me. Daniel spent 6 years deciding on my behalf what I could handle knowing. Renee spent one agonizing night not knowing anything at all and chose to let that discomfort be hers to carry instead of forcing her way into mine before I was ready to hand it over. It's a small distinction on paper. It is, in practice, the entire difference between a person who respects you and a person who simply prefers you predictable. She showed up for everything after that. She sat in Marcus's waiting room during 2 separate meetings just so I wouldn't have to walk out of a hard conversation into an empty parking lot alone. She helped me pack the kitchen when I moved out of the house Daniel and I had shared, wrapping plates in newspaper while I stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom, unable, for a full 5 minutes, to make myself walk in and start on the closet. She never once told me how to feel about any of it, and she never once let me sit in it so long that I forgot there was a life waiting for me on the other side. There's a particular kind of grace in a friendship like that, the kind that doesn't try to rescue you and doesn't abandon you either, just stands at the edge of whatever you're going through with the patience to wait until you're ready to walk out of it yourself. I don't think I would have gotten through that year the same way without her, and I've made it a point, in the years since, to try to be exactly that kind of steady for the people in my own life who need it. If I could go back and sit beside myself that Tuesday night, both of us kneeling over an open suitcase with a strange bracelet in my hands, I don't think I'd tell her what was coming. I don't think I'd want to know, honestly, not all at once. Not the full $380,000 shape of it. Not the second woman behind the first one. Not the pregnancy. Not the 18 months Vanessa spent quietly terrified of a man who held her old mistake over her head like a leash. Some things you have to walk into slowly, a room at a time, or the weight of the whole house collapses you before you've even found the door. But I would tell her a few smaller things, the kind of things I wish someone had told me on my wedding day, instead of only telling me love and finances were separate conversations for separate kinds of people. I would tell her that a man who insists you don't need to work, don't need your own money, don't need your name on the important paperwork, is not always protecting you, even when he believes, in some genuinely sincere way, that he is. Protection and control wear remarkably similar clothing, and the only real way to tell them apart is to ask yourself, honestly, whether the arrangement leaves you more capable or less capable of surviving without him. If the honest answer is less capable, it was never actually protection. It was a plan, whether or not the person building it had fully admitted that to himself. I would tell her that calm is not the same as weak, and that the version of herself who stayed quiet at that airport, who smiled at a TSA officer and let a man dig his own grave one sentence at a time instead of screaming at him in front of 40 strangers, was not being passive. She was being strategic in a way that would matter far more in the long run than any satisfying outburst could have. There is a very old and very tired idea that a woman who doesn't cry or shout when she's wronged must not be hurting very much. I want every woman listening to this to understand that the opposite is very often true. Sometimes the women who say the least in the moment are the ones already 3 steps ahead, already building the case, already deciding exactly how and when the truth is going to be allowed to land. I would tell her that discovering betrayal in layers, the way I did, first believing it was Vanessa, only to learn later that Vanessa herself had been trapped inside the same architecture of control I had, is more common than anyone talks about openly. Men who build one lie rarely build only one. If you find a single thread, pull it all the way to the end before you decide what shape the whole garment actually is. Because the first person you suspect is not always, and is in fact quite rarely, the whole story. And I would tell her, more than anything else, that the version of herself waiting on the other side of all this, the version writing this down more than a year later from a condo she owns outright, with an accountant who answers only to her, and a business with her own name on the door, and a man in her life who waits through the whole answer before he speaks, is not a smaller life than the one she's about to lose. It only looks smaller from where she's currently kneeling, on a bedroom floor, holding a stranger's bracelet. Because the life she's about to lose came wrapped in square footage and a nice zip code and other people's approval, and none of those things, it turns out, were ever actually love. They were furniture. And furniture, however expensive, was never worth confusing for a home. I've had enough women reach out to me since, through Renee, through Priya, through the strange, quiet grapevine that connects women who've survived some version of the same thing, that I want to put down a few practical things here, plainly, without any of the softening language people usually wrap around this kind of advice. Not because this is a legal document. It isn't. And I'm not a lawyer, and every situation is different enough that you should always talk to your own attorney before you act on anything you read or hear from a stranger's story. But there are a few things I wish someone had told me plainly, years before that Tuesday night, instead of leaving me to stumble into them alone at 34. Know where your name legally sits, on everything. The house, the retirement accounts, the checking accounts, the credit cards, not because you're planning for anything to go wrong, but because a marriage where only one partner has full financial visibility is a marriage where only one partner has full information about their own life. And information is not the same thing as trust, no matter how it gets framed to you at the time. If your name isn't on something, and there's no good, mutually understood reason for that, ask why, and keep asking until the answer actually makes sense. Keep a version of yourself that doesn't depend entirely on the marriage to survive. I don't mean an escape plan, exactly, though I understand now why some women build exactly that, quietly, over years, just in case. I mean a skill, a credential, a professional relationship, a small savings account that's entirely yours. Something that means if the very worst happened, you wouldn't be starting completely from zero. I let my design career atrophy for 6 years because I believed, sincerely, that Daniel's success made mine unnecessary. It didn't make it unnecessary. It made it invisible. To him and eventually to me. And invisibility is a very dangerous thing to let happen to your own competence. If you find something that doesn't add up, resist the urge to confront it in the heat of discovery. I understand the instinct. I felt it too, standing over that open suitcase at 11 at night, wanting to march down the hall and demand an answer on the spot. But a confrontation without documentation only gives the other person time to build a better lie before you've finished building your case. Write things down, take photos, keep dates. If it turns out to be nothing, you've lost nothing but a little time and a private note on your phone. If it turns out to be something, You'll be very glad you didn't hand the other person a warning shot before you were ready to use what you found. And find your Uncle Marcus, whoever that is in your life, before you think you need one. Mine had known me since I was 7 years old, and I still almost didn't call him, out of some misplaced worry that I was overreacting, that a bracelet in a suitcase wasn't a big enough problem to justify bothering a busy man with. It was a big enough problem. It is always a big enough problem to ask someone you trust for a second, clearer set of eyes. And the women I've talked to since who waited the longest to ask for help are, without exception, the ones who tell me they wish they'd made that first call sooner. The final thing I unpacked in my new condo, almost 2 months after I moved in, was a small cardboard box I'd kept sealed since the move, not because I'd forgotten about it, but because I hadn't been ready to open it. Inside was the navy suitcase, folded flat, the one with the monogrammed tag and the small compartment that had once held a stranger's bracelet and a folded wire confirmation with a single initial written on it. I'd almost thrown it away a dozen times. Something kept stopping me. Some instinct I didn't fully understand until I finally unfolded it in the middle of my new living room floor, empty afternoon light coming through windows that belonged entirely to me, and understood what I was actually looking at. It wasn't evidence anymore. It wasn't even really a suitcase anymore, not in the ordinary sense. It was the exact object that had taught me the difference between the life I thought I was living and the one that was actually happening around me the whole time, without my consent, in rooms I wasn't allowed to see into. I ran my hand along the same zippered compartment I'd searched that Tuesday night, feeling the same seam, and thought about how strange it is that an object can hold that much history in a few inches of nylon and thread. I didn't throw it away that day either, in the end. I packed it again, carefully, the way I've always packed things, light on one side and dark on the other, and put it in my hall closet, and I use it now, occasionally, for trips that have nothing to do with anyone but me. I flew to Portland in it last spring for a design conference I paid for entirely with my own money. Sat in a window seat with no one beside me I needed to perform calm for, and watched the clouds go by the way I had once watched them from seat 14A somewhere over Tennessee. Except this time, there was nothing underneath them I was bracing myself to find. Sometimes the most honest way to reclaim something isn't to destroy it. It's to keep using it, on your own terms, until it finally stops meaning what it used to mean, and starts meaning only what you decide it means now. I've told this story 100 different ways in my own head over the past 2 years, and I still haven't found one version of it that makes the whole thing feel small or simple. Because it wasn't small or simple. And I think one of the most dishonest things we do to each other, telling stories like this one, is pretend that a marriage falling apart resolves itself into a neat lesson by the end, tied off with a bow, ready to hand to the next woman who needs it. It doesn't work that way. What I have instead of a neat lesson is a collection of things I now believe more firmly than I believed almost anything at 28, standing in a church in a white dress, certain I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. I believe that the things which initially look small in a marriage, a misaligned zipper, a strange scent on a collar, a sentence caught through a half-open door, are so rarely actually small. They are almost always the visible edge of something much larger that has been building quietly, patiently, out of sight, for far longer than the discovery itself suggests. Trust your instinct when something feels wrong before you can fully explain why. The explanation usually catches up eventually. The instinct is almost never wrong about the fact that something has already shifted, even when it takes you weeks or months to understand exactly what. I believe that a person who tells you, however lovingly it's framed, that you don't need to know things about your own life, your own finances, your own household, your own future, is handing you a form of comfort that costs more than it appears to on the surface. Daniel never once, in 6 years, said a single word to me that sounded cruel. Every sentence he used to keep me uninformed was wrapped in the language of care. That, I've come to understand, is exactly how the most effective kind of control operates. It rarely announces itself as control. It almost always announces itself as protection. And the only way to tell the difference is to ask, honestly and often, whether the arrangement is making you more capable or less capable of standing on your own. I believe that money, in a marriage, is never really just money. It is a language two people use to tell each other the truth about what they actually value. And Daniel's $520,000 moved quietly out of our shared life and into a series of women and properties I never knew existed, told me more about what he actually valued than 6 years of anniversary dinners and thoughtful birthday gifts ever could. Watch where the money goes, in any relationship. Not because money is the point, but because money rarely lies about priorities, even when the person controlling it does. I believe that discovering a betrayal in layers, the way I did, first suspecting one woman and finding an entirely different one underneath, taught me something I don't think I could have learned any other way. That the first explanation is rarely the whole explanation, and that patience, however excruciating it feels in the moment, is almost always rewarded with a clearer, more complete picture than panic ever produces. I wanted, so badly in that Charleston hotel room, to have the whole story the moment I found the bracelet. I didn't get the whole story until I'd been patient enough, calm enough, and quiet enough to let each layer reveal itself on its own schedule instead of mine. And I believe more than anything else that the true measure of a person isn't whether they ever make a mistake, because everyone does, in ways large and small, across the whole span of a life. The true measure is whether they have the honesty to stop once the mistake is visible and actually change course, rather than building an increasingly elaborate architecture of explanations designed to protect the version of themselves they'd rather you kept believing in. Daniel never stopped explaining. Not once in 6 years did he simply say, plainly, without an accompanying justification, that he had done something wrong and intended to be different because of it. Vanessa, trapped in circumstances far more sympathetic than his, at least eventually told me the truth when she had every incentive not to. That difference, more than the money, more than the bracelet, more than any single fact in this entire story, is the one I carry with me now as the actual measure of a person's character. Not whether they ever fall short, but whether, once they're seen falling short, they have the courage to stand still and let themselves actually be seen. Money can be rebuilt. I rebuilt mine, slower than I would have liked, but completely, on terms that belonged entirely to me. Reputations, given enough time and enough new rooms to walk into, tend to recover too, which is a frustrating thing to accept about the world, but an honest one. What is much harder to rebuild, once it's gone, is the basic decency of simply telling the person who loves you the truth about your own life, even when the truth is inconvenient, even when it costs you something to say it. I would rather have less and know exactly what I have than live one more year inside a beautiful house built on a foundation I was never allowed to inspect. If you take one thing from everything I've told you here, let it be this. The smallest, quietest details in your own life are worth trusting. A bracelet that shouldn't be there, a sentence overheard through a cracked door, a number that doesn't quite add up the way it's been explained to you. You don't need to react to any of it immediately. And you certainly don't need to burn your life down over a single loose thread before you understand what it's actually attached to. But you owe it to yourself to pull on it, patiently, honestly, for as long as it takes to see the whole shape of what's been hidden from you. I promise you, whatever you find at the end of that thread, that the woman who finally sees clearly, even if what she sees breaks her heart completely open, is always, in the end, in a stronger position than the woman who chose comfortable blindness instead. I know, because I was both of those women, 18 months apart, and I would never, not for one single day of the easier version, choose to go back. The finalization itself was almost anticlimactic, which I think surprised me more than anything else about the entire process. I had spent months bracing for a courtroom scene out of a movie, a judge banging a gavel, Daniel and me seated at opposite tables glaring past our respective attorneys. What actually happened was quieter and, in its own way, sadder. Marcus and Daniel's attorney had negotiated nearly everything in advance, so the court appearance itself took less than 20 minutes. A judge reviewing the settlement terms in a flat, efficient voice, asking each of us in turn whether we understood and agreed to the terms as written. Both of us saying yes in voices that sounded, to my own ears, strangely calm for two people formally ending 6 years of a shared life. Daniel wore a gray suit I didn't recognize, which struck me, sitting there, as its own small piece of evidence that he'd already built an entire life apart from the one we'd shared. New clothes, new routines, new versions of himself I would never see the inside of. He caught my eye once, briefly, as we were both signing our respective copies of the settlement at a long table outside the courtroom, and gave me a small, unreadable nod. The kind of gesture you give a former colleague at a conference, rather than someone you once promised your whole life to. I nodded back, and that was, essentially, the entire ceremony of it. No vows undone with any particular ritual, no dramatic final words, just 2 signatures, 20 minutes apart, on a document that quietly, legally, made official what had actually already ended months earlier in a Charleston hotel room over a felt jewelry box neither of us had asked to find. Marcus took me to lunch afterward, at a small diner near the courthouse he said he'd been going to for 30 years, since long before he had any grand career at all. "How do you feel?" he asked, once we'd ordered. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Lighter," I said, which surprises me a little. I expected to feel sad, and I do, somewhere in there. But mostly I just feel like I finally got to put something down that I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it actually was. He smiled, the particular smile of someone who has spent 30 years watching people arrive at exactly that realization, and never quite gets tired of witnessing it fresh each time. "That's usually how it goes," he said. "The fear beforehand is almost always worse than the actual moment. It's the not knowing that wears people down. Once the decision's made and the paper's signed, most people find there's a strange kind of relief waiting on the other side of it, even when the outcome isn't what they would have chosen for themselves 10 years earlier." "I don't think I would have believed you a year ago if you'd told me I'd feel relief signing my own divorce papers," I said. "A year ago," Marcus said, "you were still the woman kneeling on a bedroom floor, holding a stranger's bracelet, trying to decide whether you could trust your own hands. You're not that woman anymore, Olivia. You haven't been for a while now. I think you just needed the paperwork to catch up to something you'd already become. There's a small detail I haven't mentioned yet, one that people ask me about more than almost anything else in this story, usually near the end of a conversation, almost as an afterthought, though I don't think it's an afterthought at all. I never changed my name back, not because I wanted to hold on to anything about being Daniel's wife, but because somewhere in the middle of rebuilding my client list that first summer, I realized my professional reputation, the small but growing body of design work I'd started putting my name on again, was already accumulating under Olivia Whitfield, and changing it back to my maiden name would have meant, in some strange practical sense, starting the visibility of my own career over from zero a second time, for the sake of a symbolic gesture that, the longer I sat with it, felt less and less necessary. I remember mentioning this to my mother, half expecting her to be surprised, maybe even a little hurt on my father's behalf, that I wasn't reclaiming the name he'd given me. Instead, she just shrugged. The particular shrug she's always given to questions she considers beneath serious debate. "A name is just a name, Olivia," she said. "What matters is what you build underneath it. You could keep his name and build an entirely different life with it than the one you had while you were married to him, and that life would still be entirely yours. Or you could take mine back and still let yourself be small inside it." The name was never the thing keeping you stuck. It was everything you weren't allowed to know while you were living inside it. She was right, in the way she was usually right about things that took me much longer to arrive at on my own. The name on my business cards now, Olivia Whitfield Design, has nothing to do with Daniel anymore, in any way that matters. It's simply the name that's on my lease, my accounts, my client contracts, all of them fully and completely mine, controlled by no one but me. I think there's something almost fitting about that, using the one piece of him that remains, not as a wound, but as proof of exactly how far I've carried myself past the life that name originally described. People ask me, more than almost anything else, what happened to everyone else in this story once the dust settled? So I'll answer that plainly here, before I close this out. Vanessa and I exchanged a handful of emails over the following year, cautious at first, then gradually warmer. She reached out initially just to confirm a detail Patricia Nguyen's office needed clarified, and somewhere in the process of a few back-and-forth messages, we ended up talking briefly about how she was doing in Austin. She told me, in one of those emails, that she'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in her life, working through what she called the specific shame of having been someone's convenient scapegoat, and that untangling her own guilt from the reality of what had actually been done to her was slower going than she expected. I told her I hoped it kept getting easier, and I meant it. I don't know if we'll ever be friends exactly. I think we'll always exist to each other as two women who met each other at the worst possible angle, in the middle of the worst thing either of us had been through, and who managed, against fairly steep odds, to be honest with each other anyway. Sophia Bennett, as far as I know, still runs her design studio in Charleston. She had the baby, a girl, a little over a year after everything came apart, and I heard through the same distant grapevine that eventually reaches everyone in a story like this, that she and Daniel are not together, that whatever it was between them collapsed under its own weight not long after the money that had been quietly funding it dried up. I feel, when I think about her, an emotion I don't have a clean word for, something between anger that never fully resolved and a strange, unwilling sympathy for a woman who, whatever her choices, is now raising a child largely on her own, several states away from her own family, having learned the hard way that a man who lies easily to one woman rarely reserves his honesty exclusively for the next one. I hope her daughter grows up surrounded by more truth than either of us started out with. Frank Alvarez still sends me a card every December, which continues to surprise me each time it arrives. Last year's simply said, "Still glad you were the smartest person at that dinner table. Hope the new year treats you well, Olivia." I keep them, all of them, in a drawer in my kitchen, a strange little collection of belated respect from a man who spent one entire dinner treating me like decoration and has spent every year since trying, in his own limited way, to make up for it. Daniel's mother and I still speak occasionally, mostly around holidays. Brief, warm, careful conversations that neither of us has ever quite found the right way to end. She sent flowers the week my design business landed its first major hospitality client, a small card tucked among them that read simply, "Proud of you, sweetheart. Always was, even when I wasn't sure I was allowed to say so." I cried reading that, more than I expected to, because somewhere in that sentence was an entire unspoken acknowledgement of everything she'd watched her son do, and everything she'd wished, quietly, she had the standing to stop. It's been a little over 2 years now since that Tuesday night on my bedroom floor, and I want to tell you honestly what my life actually looks like now. Not the polished version, the real one. Because I think stories like this one too often skip the unglamorous middle distance between disaster and whatever comes after. And that middle distance is where most of the actual living happens. I still run my own design practice, based out of a small studio space I lease above a bakery in the Highlands, close enough that the whole building smells faintly of cinnamon most mornings, which is a strange, specific kind of happiness I never knew I wanted until I had it. I have 4 steady clients and a rotating handful of smaller projects, enough work that I had to hire a part-time assistant this past spring, a recent design school graduate named Jasmine, who reminds me, in small ways, of exactly how much confidence I'd lost without ever fully noticing it was happening, back when I was her age and just starting out. Before Daniel. Before any of this. Theo and I moved in together last fall, into a house he found with good bones and worse plumbing, which he's been slowly, happily rebuilding with his own hands in the evenings, the same patient, unhurried way he does everything. I kept my condo and rented out. Some part of me isn't ready yet to fully let go of the first place that was ever entirely, unquestionably mine. And Theo has never once made me feel like I needed to explain that to him. We're not engaged. We've talked about it. In the loose, unhurried way 2 people talk about a future they're both fairly confident they want, without any rush to formalize it on anyone else's timeline. I've learned, the hard way, that a piece of paper was never actually the thing that made a relationship safe. What makes it safe is whether the person across from you tells you the truth on the days it would be easier not to. And Theo, 2 years in, has never once failed that particular test. I talk to my mother every Sunday. I see Renee most weeks, still, usually over tacos at the same place Theo took me on our 3rd date, which has become, without either of us planning it, something like our regular spot. Marcus and I have dinner every few months, less as attorney and client now, and more as 2 people who went through something difficult together and came out the other side with a friendship neither of us expected, but both of us are grateful for. Vanessa and I still exchange the occasional email. I sent flowers when she got a promotion at her compliance job in Austin. She sent a card when my studio's first big project got written up in a regional design magazine. 3 sentences, warm and short. Saw the article. You built something real. I'm genuinely happy for you. I still don't know exactly what to call the years I spent married to Daniel. Not a mistake exactly, because I met people through that life, learned things about myself, including some hard, necessary things about how easily I could be quietly managed by someone charming enough to make it feel like care. Not a waste either, though there are days it still stings to do the math on what 6 years of unpaid household labor and quiet financial invisibility actually cost me. In career momentum, in confidence, in money I'll spend the next several years rebuilding instead of simply having. I've settled, mostly, on calling it exactly what it was. The version of my life before I learned to trust myself completely, and the version I had to walk all the way through, thread by thread, before I could build the one I actually wanted. A few weeks before I sat down to actually tell this whole story from start to finish, I scrolled all the way back through the Suitcase file on my phone, the same Notes app entry I started somewhere over Tennessee, back when I still thought the worst of it began and ended with a bracelet and a woman named Vanessa. I hadn't opened it in over a year. I almost deleted it a dozen times in that year, the way you sometimes want to delete a photo of yourself from a period of your life you'd rather not remember looking at directly. Something always stopped me. Reading it again, start to finish, felt like reading a transcript of a woman I both am and am not anymore. The early entries are so careful, so clinical. Dates and facts laid out with almost no emotion attached to them at all, and I remember now exactly why. I didn't trust myself yet to know the difference between what I was actually observing and what I was afraid I might be imagining. So I stripped every entry down to the barest possible skeleton of fact, as if feelings were a kind of contamination that might corrupt the evidence. It took nearly 2 weeks of entries before I let myself write anything that admitted, plainly, that I was hurting. Since this morning, Daniel has explained himself 6 separate times. He has not once asked if I'm okay. I remember exactly how much it cost me to type that sentence, sitting in seat 14A, and reading it again 2 years later, I felt an unexpected tenderness toward the woman who wrote it. The same tenderness you might feel watching an old home video of yourself as a child, doing something brave without any idea yet how brave it actually was. The very last entry in the file, dated the night before I moved out of the house Daniel and I shared, reads simply, "Tomorrow I stop documenting what happened to me and start building what happens next." I don't remember writing it, not specifically, though I know it's mine, in my own voice, at the exact hinge point between the two halves of my life. I closed the app that afternoon, a few weeks ago, and didn't reopen it, and I don't think I need to again. It did exactly what I built it to do. It held the truth steady long enough for me to stop doubting my own eyes, and once it had done that, its job was finished. The same way a scaffolding comes down once the building underneath it can finally stand entirely on its own. I used to think stories like this one needed a villain and a victim, a clean moral arithmetic where one person is entirely wrong and the other entirely wronged, and everyone listening walks away knowing exactly whose side to take. Real life, I've learned, is rarely built that cleanly. Daniel was not a monster who woke up one morning and decided to destroy our marriage on purpose. He was, as far as I can tell, a man who slowly, over years, convinced himself that keeping me comfortable and keeping me informed were the same thing. Until one day they weren't. And by then, the gap between them had grown so wide that the only way to keep me from noticing was to build an entire second architecture of lies around it. That doesn't excuse anything he did. It just means the truth is more complicated and more human than a simple villain would have been. And I think there's something important in sitting with that complication instead of flattening it into something easier to hate. What I know now, with 2 full years of distance and rebuilding behind me, is this. Marriages don't usually fail because two people stop loving each other at the beginning. They fail because somewhere along the way, one or both people forget how to protect what they once genuinely cherished and start protecting instead their own comfort, their own image, their own ability to avoid a hard conversation for one more day. Nobody sets out on their wedding day planning to become the kind of person who hides a bracelet in their wife's suitcase. It happens in small steps, each one slightly easier to justify than the last, until the person doing the justifying no longer recognizes how far they've traveled from where they started. I chose to leave, not because I ran out of love, not entirely, but because I understood, finally and completely, that staying inside a marriage where trust had been this thoroughly dismantled would have cost me something I was no longer willing to pay. The steady, quiet confidence in my own perception of reality that I'd spent 6 years slowly trading away without ever fully agreeing to the exchange. Daniel lost more than a marriage and more than a company. He lost the specific, irreplaceable kind of trust that, once broken this completely, almost never fully rebuilds, no matter how much time passes or how many new lives get built on top of the wreckage. If there's a single truth I'd want anyone to carry away from everything I've told you, it's this one. The small, quiet details of your own life deserve to be trusted, and you are allowed, always, to ask questions until the answers actually make sense to you, regardless of how gently or how firmly someone tries to convince you that you don't need to know. Life is rarely perfectly fair, but I've come to believe cause and effect are almost always, eventually, remarkably clear. What you build honestly tends to hold. What you build on a foundation of half-truths and careful omissions tends, sooner or later, to come apart. Usually at the exact moment someone finally opens the wrong compartment of the wrong suitcase and decides, quietly, that she's done pretending not to see. I hope, whoever is listening to this, wherever you are in your own version of this story, that you find your own thread before it's too late to pull it, and that when you do, you have the patience to follow it all the way to the end, and the courage to build whatever comes next entirely on your own terms. That's the whole of what I have to offer you. Not a clean lesson, not a tidy moral. Just one woman's honest account of the night everything started to unravel, and everything, slowly, that she built in its place. There's one question I get more than any other, always near the very end of telling this story, and it's usually asked quietly, almost apologetically, as if the person asking already suspects the answer might embarrass them. They ask whether I ever wanted to go back, whether in some private, unguarded moment, I considered simply forgiving Daniel completely and trying to rebuild what we'd had, given how much history sat underneath everything that happened, given that 6 years is not a small thing to walk away from, given that some part of the man who once carried my suitcase up 3 flights of stairs in Vail had, presumably, still existed somewhere underneath everything he became. I want to answer that honestly, because I think the honest answer matters more than the tidy one. There was a night, about 3 months after I moved out, sitting alone in my new condo with a glass of wine I didn't finish, when I opened a text message to Daniel and typed out 4 sentences I never sent. I don't remember the exact wording anymore, only the shape of it. Something about missing the version of us that existed before any of this. Something about wondering if enough time and enough honesty could ever rebuild what we'd lost. I sat with that unsent message open on my screen for almost 20 minutes, thumb hovering over the send button, feeling every version of loneliness that comes with genuinely starting over at 34, alone, in a smaller apartment, without the life I'd spent 6 years assuming was permanent. I didn't send it. Not because I'd stopped feeling that loneliness, and not because some sudden burst of clarity arrived to save me from myself. I didn't send it because, sitting there, I made myself finish a harder exercise first. I made myself imagine, honestly, what actually sending it and getting the response I wanted would look like 6 months later. Would Daniel have become, overnight, a man who told me the truth without being caught first? Would the account under someone else's name simply never have happened again? This time for good? On nothing more than the strength of one lonely, wine-softened text message? I already knew the answer, because I had watched, for 3 straight days in Charleston, exactly how a person behaves when they're finally out of room to keep lying. And even then, even cornered, even confronted with hard evidence, Daniel's very first instinct had still been to explain rather than to simply, plainly apologize. People show you, under pressure, who they actually are. I had already been shown. The unsent text wasn't really about Daniel at all in the end. It was about grief. Missing the comfortable, familiar shape of a life I'd known, even one I understood with total clarity, had been built on a foundation that was never sound. Comfort and rightness are not the same thing. And that night taught me, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire story, how easily the two can get confused when you're tired and lonely, and the alternative feels, in the moment, unbearably difficult. I deleted the message instead of sending it, closed my phone, and sat with the loneliness a while longer. Because I had already learned by then that the discomfort of sitting with a hard feeling honestly was almost always more bearable in the long run than the relief of escaping it into something I already knew wasn't actually going to fix anything. That, I think, more than any single piece of evidence I gathered in Charleston, was the moment I actually finished the divorce. Not the day I signed the papers. The night, alone, with an unsent text message, that I chose the harder, truer feeling over the easier, familiar one, and went to bed anyway, and woke up the next morning still entirely, completely myself. Thank you for listening to all of it. I hope, wherever you are in your own version of this story, that you find whatever thread is waiting for you to pull, and that you have the patience to follow it all the way to the end. I want to leave you with the image I keep coming back to more than any other from this whole story, more than the airport, more than the hotel room, more than the courthouse hallway with its long table of settlement papers. It's much smaller than any of that. It's the image of myself on that first Tuesday night, kneeling on my bedroom floor, running my hand along the inside of a suitcase out of nothing more than habit. A careful, unremarkable ritual I'd performed 100 times before, without it ever once meaning anything beyond making sure I hadn't forgotten my phone charger. I think about how easily that moment could have gone differently. If I'd been a less careful packer, if I'd zipped that compartment shut without checking it one more time, the way Daniel always teased me for doing, if I'd found the bracelet and, in a panic, confronted him immediately instead of taking the time to think it through. There were a dozen smaller versions of that night where the whole story unfolds differently, where I never learn what I learned, where I spend another year, another 5 years, another whole lifetime inside a marriage quietly built on a foundation I was never permitted to inspect. I don't say that to suggest I got lucky exactly, though there is some luck folded into it. I say it because I want you to understand how much of what changed my life came down to a habit so small I never once considered it meaningful, until the night it mattered more than almost anything else I've ever done. Check your own suitcase. Ask your own questions. Trust the version of yourself that notices when something feels slightly wrong, even before you can explain exactly why. That instinct, small and quiet and easy to dismiss, is very often the only warning you're going to get, and it deserves far more of your attention than any of us are usually taught to give it. That's the whole story. Not a lesson wrapped in a bow, just one woman, one suitcase, and everything that unraveled, and everything, slowly and honestly, that got rebuilt in its place.